God, we thank you that we can be here tonight. We thank you for this time that we can worship. God, we thank you for Ben, and we thank you for the heart that he has for our college students. We thank you for the heart that he has for just living the life that you have put before him. And God, we thank you for the message that you've given him tonight. And God, we love you and pray all these things in Jesus' name.
Yeah, it's actually, I think the first time I spoke here at Greenwood Park was the summer series on a Wednesday, near about a year ago today. So it's kind of crazy that it's been a year. It both feels like it's been so much longer than a year and that almost no time has passed. But it's been incredible to get to be here at Greenwood Park. And I've been honored to get to serve as the campus minister for the last year here. Tonight, we're going to continue our summer series, which has been focused on the Apostles' Creed, entitled We Believe. And already we've talked some about some of the different aspects of that Apostles' Creed. We talked about how we believe in God the Father, how we believe in Jesus Christ the Son, how we believe in the Holy Spirit. And tonight, we continue that journey, talking about we believe in the forgiveness of sins. That's kind of the sentence of the creed that we're going to focus on tonight. We believe in the forgiveness of sins. And I have to level with you up front. If I could have picked any of the different topics from the Apostles' Creed, forgiveness of sins probably would have been the last one I would have picked. And it's not because I don't think it's important. In fact, it's hard to get more central than forgiveness of sins. I mean, that's one of those concepts that we hear and talk about over and over and over again. It doesn't get more central than that when it comes to the Christian faith. But that's part of the reason that I didn't want it. I feel almost unqualified to talk about a topic that people have talked about for thousands of years now. I feel somewhat unqualified to tackle such a big topic like this one. On top of that, it's been a week for me. It's just been one of those weeks where like I couldn't get any traction all day today. I sat there with my head up against the wall just trying to figure out how I wanted to talk about this tonight, and we'll see if it actually came together or not. We're kind of in this journey together. So if you're worried after all that about how it's going to go tonight, you're not alone. You're in good company. But the good news is God has a track record of speaking through broken vessels. So we'll just kind of lean on the power of the Spirit here tonight. And worst case scenario, if it's half as bad as I imagine this might be, then we can just say this was all an exercise in practicing some of that forgiveness that we're talking about tonight. You guys can extend some of that to me, and it'll just be an embodiment. So either way, it's a win-win for me. But we believe in the forgiveness of sins. Is our topic for tonight. And while it wasn't necessarily the topic I would have chosen, I can't think of a more timely topic than this one. Because the truth is, I think we live in an age that has forgotten the need or the place of forgiveness in the world. I think if you look at the world around us, it's hard to find good examples of forgiveness a lot of times. We live in a world that is increasingly more divided. We live in a world that is increasingly more angry, and there seems to be less and less forgiveness in the world. And when you stop and think about sort of the culture and the world that we live in, I think it almost makes some degree of sense, because we live in a world that is increasingly becoming more and more relative when it comes to questions of morality. Right and wrong become a matter of opinion. Good and bad become kind of just personal terms that you use for certain things. Our purpose and function is a question that you either get to choose the answer to, or that nobody can know exactly why we're here and what we're meant to do. And as we live in a world that gets filled with more and more of that type of gray, there's less and less of a place for forgiveness. When we have less and less of an understanding of objective right and wrong, we feel less and less of a need to seek forgiveness for those things that we do that might be considered traditionally right or wrong. When we live in a world where good and bad become matters of opinion, we have less and less of a need to seek out forgiveness from other people. And even if we could nail down what right and wrong was, even if we could speak in certain terms and decide exactly what's right and exactly what's wrong, who are you to forgive me? Who am I to forgive you? When we use that sort of language, when we say that I forgive you, or when you say that you forgive me, we're assuming that we have some sort of right to pronounce forgiveness over you, that I had some sort of right of judgment or recompense, and my forgiveness is me letting go of that right that I had. We live in a world where there's increasingly less and less need or place for forgiveness. I was thinking about this topic, and I was trying to think about the last time I heard somebody say in conversation, "I forgive you." And I couldn't come up with a solid moment where I said that to somebody else or somebody else said that to me. And I'm sure I've heard it before, maybe a parent kind of encouraging their child to forgive a friend who'd hurt their feelings or taken a toy. I'm sure I've heard it. But I couldn't remember a moment where I said that to someone or someone said that to me. And instead, we've moved away from words like, "I forgive you," but when someone does something wrong, if you were to gossip about me or open the door and stub my toe, rather than "I forgive you," we tend to use language like "that's okay" or "it's all right." And you might think I'm nitpicking here, right? Because these are just words and we're effectively communicating the same thing. But I think the words that we use communicate something about what's going on in our brain. And I think the words that we use actually form how we think about things. And so more and more, as the world has moved away from language of forgiveness and moved more and more towards language about the circumstance, that it's okay or I'll be all right or no harm, no foul, as we've moved away from language of forgiveness, language of morality, and moved more towards language of circumstance, I think we've seen a world that has become consumed by guilt. Because if I can't tell you that I forgive you, if I can't release you of the guilt that comes from encountering a wrong decision, if I can't release you from the guilt that you have from wronging me in some sort of way, you have to carry that guilt around with you. I think we live in a world that is increasingly more consumed by guilt. I think guilt that we don't work hard enough or our lives aren't meaningful enough is what drives people to workaholism. I think guilt that we're not kind enough or good enough drives people to isolation or to relationships that are dangerously compliant. I think people who can't take criticism, beneath all of that is this deep-seated guilt. That even if what you're saying about me, even if the criticism that you're giving me isn't true, if only you really knew what I had wrong on the inside, then how much more would you be right to criticize me? I think we live in a world that is consumed with guilt, and so what better time to talk about the concept of forgiveness? To do that tonight, I want to go to Matthew chapter 18. We're going to be in verse 22, and we're just going to be in this one story that Jesus tells all night, this story that's all about forgiveness and how forgiveness operates. So kind of set the scene. Jesus has been talking to his disciples, and he's been talking to them about how relationships work in this kingdom that he has come to build. He's talking about how disciples are meant to interact with one another. And he's just gotten done talking about how disciples are supposed to be patient with one another, disciples are supposed to be kind to one another, disciples are supposed to be forgiving to one another. And after this conversation, Peter comes up and he asks Jesus. He says, okay, let's get practical. Let's get real. You told me I'm supposed to forgive my brother, but how many times, right? How many times am I supposed to give my brother? Up to 7, right? Does that sound good, Jesus? And he's probably feeling pretty good about himself because 7 is a lot of times to forgive somebody who's wronged you. And Jesus is like, no, it's not 7 times. It's 77 times or 70 times 7 times. It's not that you have to count the amount of forgiveness that you give to other people, but what Jesus says is when you enter into this kingdom, you're a fount of forgiveness that flows freely and washes over other people. In fact, Jesus is doing really cool stuff with these numbers here, 77 and 7. They only happen one other time in the Bible. We don't have time to chase that rabbit tonight. But Jesus, in effect, is not saying that you have to keep track, and on the 78th time you don't forgive your brother. What he's saying is on the 78th, the 79th, the 100th, the 100 millionth time, you are a fount of forgiveness for the wrongdoing that people turn towards you, turn towards other again and again and again. But at this point, Jesus has been with his disciples long enough to anticipate the next question, right? He's just called Peter into this really incredibly difficult task. Don't forgive your brother only 7 times. Forgive your brother 77 times. Become this never-ending fount of forgiveness to your brother and sister. He just called him this incredible task, and Jesus knows that the next question is going to be, if that's what I'm supposed to do, if that's what I'm supposed to be, Show me how to get there. And so Jesus tells this story. Matthew chapter 18, starting in verse 23. I want to pull 3 different things out of this parable that talk about guilt and forgiveness. The first thing I want us to notice is the feeling of guilt, what that feeling is and where that feeling comes from. The second thing I want us to notice is how does God deal with that guilt that we feel and experience. And the last thing I want to talk about is how do we heal from the guilt that we have and experience. Matthew chapter 18, starting in verse 23. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. And as he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 bags of gold was brought to him. Okay, so pause there for just a second. Here's this king, and he's decided that he wants to settle up all his accounts. And so he's bringing people in, and this guy gets brought before him who owes him 10,000, my translation says, bags of gold, and maybe your translation says 10,000 talents. And I think, as a general rule, Jesus is a lot more funny than we give him credit for, because this is a joke that we're all supposed to laugh at. Like, 10,000 talents is a ridiculous amount of money. On average, a laborer like this guy who Jesus is talking to would have made 1 to 1.5 talents a year. Basically, this guy had racked up a debt that was 10,000 years of his annual salary. I mean, it is a laughable number. Jesus is setting before us this number that is so ridiculous that he's communicating it is an unfathomable debt that this servant owes. And this guy gets brought before the king. Since he was not able to pay the master, right? Since he was not able to pay, because who has 10,000 years worth of salary just lying around they can hand over. So since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. And I just have to wonder to myself, how did this guy get into this situation? Not only that, but what was he thinking? What was he feeling when he was doing whatever it was to get into that situation? Like, he had to know that there was some sort of reckoning coming down the line. He was spending his master's money like nobody's business, borrowing again and again. Maybe he borrowed it all in one lump sum, and he knew that he had this debt that was hanging over his head, and he knew that at some point there was going to be a price to pay. The anxiety and the fear and the worry with every dollar that he spent had to be astronomical. The anxiety and the fear and the worry that he felt when somebody came and said, hey, the king wants to talk to you about that debt that you owe, had to be astronomical. And here Jesus is demonstrating for us what the feeling of guilt actually is. See, in the modern world in which we live, people oftentimes say that the feeling of guilt is nothing more than an emotion, right? This feeling of guilt that we have, it comes from unfair expectations that have been put on us, whether by ourselves, whether by our parents, whether by our culture. And if we could just learn to adapt our expectations, to be more comfortable with who we are, to be more comfortable with pursuing our true and authentic self, if we could just get to that place, then those feelings of guilt, those feelings that we do something wrong, those would just vanish away into the vapor. And Jesus here is making the exact opposite point. He's saying, no. Guilt isn't just some sort of emotion that you feel. But guilt is a signpost that there is a moral law in this universe, and that you have broken that moral law. And you are racking up this debt day in and day out. And just like the servant, you know there's got to be a price to pay at the end of the line. Just like the servant, you know, based off this guilt that you feel inside of you, there's something coming down the tracks towards you. And you can run from it, you can hide from it, but at some point, the cost has got to be settled. In those quiet moments that we all have, where we sit and begin to understand the depth of the brokenness that we feel, can we really just say that guilt that we experience is an emotion? Can you just convince yourself that the guilt that you feel is just some sort of construct that's been placed upon you? Because that just doesn't cut it for me. Deep down, I know that there is a moral objective law in the universe, and I have broken it too many times to count. And not just a little bit, not just some. I have missed the mark horribly, again and again and again. The debt that I have racked up is laughable. It's unfathomable. And the price comes due. That's what the feeling of guilt is. It's this signpost of a reality that is coming for every person in this room. And this is one of the reasons that I didn't want to talk about this topic, because none of us like to sit and reflect on this brokenness that we experience and feel. None of us get joy out of this moment. In fact, if you're anything like me, when this topic gets brought up, I engage with it purely on an intellectual level and not on a personal level, because I don't have the courage to think about just how deep my brokenness runs. But for just a moment, take the courage and reflect on the reality that Jesus is pointing to. That there's a moral objective law, that we've all broken it, that we've all fallen short, not a little bit, but a lot. And the debt that we have racked up is laughable. You can have that kind of courage because the good news comes next. We have this feeling of guilt. We know that it's not just an emotion, but it's a reality that we experience. But the next question is, how does God deal with the debt? How does he deal with this guilt that we feel? Matthew chapter 18, verse 26. At this, the servant fell. He's just been placed in this horrible situation. He and his family are going to be sold. At this, the servant fell on his knees before him, and be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. We'll come back to the servant's response in a second. Be patient with me, he begged, and I will pay back everything. And the servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. He was this guy for who knows how long, however many years this debt had been hanging over his head. And he knew this day of reckoning was going to come. He knew the bill was going to come due, and he knew that he wasn't going to be able to pay the price. And he butts up against that moment. He butts up against all of his failures and all of his stupidity, all of the falling short that he had done again and again. He brushes up against it. And he falls on his knees, overwhelmed at just how far he's fallen. And he pleads and he begs. And almost before he can even get the words out, the king cancels the debt. This moment that he's been dreading is gone, done, over with. But I want us to pay attention, right? Because it's not like magically the king's just going to forgive this debt and his treasury is restocked with all the money that was spent. When the king decides to cancel the debt, what he's saying is, I'm going to take the cost that you owe upon myself. The bill that you have racked up, I'm going to pay it. All the devastation and destruction and hardship and guilt and shame and brokenness that was due you because of the decisions that you've made, I'm going to take those things upon myself. The king chooses to pay the price for the servant. And it's the epitome of the story of the gospel, right? This moment of substitution. One of the people I read in preparation for tonight, they put it the best I've almost ever heard it, that as sin is us trying to step into God's place, salvation is God stepping into our place. As sin is us stepping into a place that we don't deserve and taking on all these things that we shouldn't have to take on, that we were never made to take on. So salvation is God stepping into a place that he didn't deserve to take on all these things that he was never made or meant to take on himself. The way that God deals with guilt is the simple truth of forgiveness. That as you and I butt up against the midst of the brokenness that we've experienced, all the things that we have done wrong, that deep and dark feeling that settles upon us in those moments when we realize how far we've fallen, that he has stepped into that arena for us and paid the price that you and I deserve. How does God deal with our guilt? It's with the reality of forgiveness. A forgiveness that isn't free, that isn't cheap, but it's bought with the highest of price and with the deepest of loves. So the last question we have for tonight, and then we'll be done, is how do we heal from this guilt? Right? Because if you're anything like me, intellectually it's easy for me to understand this sort of story. Right? It's the sort of story I've heard my whole life, that I'm broken beyond repair, and that thankfully there's a Savior who's forgiven me. And so the question becomes, how do we heal from that guilt? How do we move it from beyond our head and move it into somewhere that's more permanent? Move it into somewhere that affects how we go about our lives, where it's not just some sort of fact that we can spew to other people, but it permeates every bit of our reality and being. How do we overcome the guilt that we have? How do we experience and not just understand the forgiveness that God offers to us? The rest of the parable goes like this. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 silver coins, a much smaller debt, right? Like $2,000 compared to $10 million. He grabbed him and began to choke him. "Pay back what you owe me," he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, "Be patient with me, and I will pay it back." But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could pay the debt. And when the other servants saw what had happened, they were outraged and went and told their master everything that had happened. And then the master called the servant in. "You wicked servant," he said, "I canceled all that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had it on you?" In anger, his master handed him over to the jailers to be tortured until he should pay back all that he owed. And that's the end of the parable. Right? He was this guy who didn't get it. And it's so easy for me to step into a place of judgment and say, what an imbecile this guy was. I mean, again, Jesus is funnier than I think we give him credit for. I mean, here's this guy that everybody, when the story's done, they are disgusted with this character. I mean, who would do this, right? Who would be forgiven a life-ending debt and then go beat somebody up for a couple of coins? Here's a guy who didn't get it. The reality of the forgiveness that he was given maybe settled into his head, but it didn't settle into his heart. But as much as I want to give this guy a hard time, I wonder to myself, how often am I this guy? So let's put ourselves in his shoes. Why does he do this? Why is this his response? And I think the answer comes in verse 26. The servant's response when he's confronted with this radical forgiveness that he receives. This is what he says: "Be patient with me, and I will pay back everything." And again, what a joke. Yeah, be patient with me, right? Okay, give me some time, and somewhere I will collect 10,000 years worth of salary to give you. Who does this guy think he is? Where is he going to get this kind of money? Is he going to rob the king a kingdom over and bring back all the money to pay off the debt? That's his attitude. When he has this life-ending debt that he's racked up, that he has no chance, no hope of paying, and he's confronted with the most radical, most freeing forgiveness that he's ever experienced, this king who is willing to take on a kingdom-ending debt to set him free. He can't handle it. His brain can't make the shift. He says, "You give me some time, and I will pay you back everything you are due." Before we talk about the correct response to what this sort of forgiveness is, how we heal from guilt, here's a great example of an incorrect response. I think there are two incorrect responses, and one of them, this guy captures so perfectly. Because here's a guy who couldn't deal with it. He couldn't deal with daring to believe that the king meant every word that he said. He was offered this gift of radical forgiveness and grace. The debt would be canceled, that he would be set free and lifted out of this burden, this hole that he had dug himself in, and he couldn't believe it. He had to go out and try to find some way to repay that debt. he still lived under the same fear that he wasn't good enough and that the debt was going to come due. He couldn't take the king at his word. He couldn't dare believe that the forgiveness that he offered was real or genuine. And how many times do I find myself in that position? How many times do I find myself in a position where I beat myself up, I tear myself to shreds because I won't dare believe that the forgiveness the king offers is true? How many times do I choose to hold other people to the same standard that I hold myself to, that I can't live up to, that I have no hope of living up to, and I tear them to shreds because I can't dare think that the king's forgiveness is true? I mean, just today, again, I told you I had my head against the wall on this lesson. I couldn't figure out how it was going to come together, if it was going to come together, and I had my own little miniature emotional breakdown. Because I started thinking, like, where's my value? What's my purpose? Like, what am I doing? Like, why can't I make this work? Like, how come I can't figure out how to capture this really big concept in 30 minutes? And I kept beating myself up over it again and again and again. And if I hadn't been teaching on forgiveness, I would have carried that guilt around with me for the next couple of weeks, next couple of months, that I couldn't figure out how to bring all of this together. Because I won't dare believe that the forgiveness that the king offers is true. And I torture myself keeping track and keeping record of how many rights I get, of how many wrongs I get. Because if I get too many wrongs, the debt's still going to come due and I'm going to have to pay it all over again. And I won't let myself experience the freedom and the joy and the love that comes with surrendering to that gift. The second response, really quickly, that I think is a wrong response, is to misunderstand the amount that is due. Some of us struggle to understand just how broken, just how far we have fallen, just how many times we miss the mark. And when that's the case, the forgiveness that God offers, the forgiveness the king extends, seems cheap and irrelevant. We find ourselves back in that position of, if my brokenness isn't really that bad, if the forgiveness is really cheap and it flows so freely and so easily, if it's not something difficult or hard to accomplish, then why do I still feel the way that I do? Why does this guilt still run me over? We can't undersell the debt that we owe. But we also have to believe, we have to trust that the king has settled the debt for us. And once that happens, we are poised to have the correct response, to hold these two things that seem on opposite ends of the spectrum in tension. To know on the one hand just how broken we are, how far we have fallen, how sinful our nature runs. But on the other hand, to know that even in the midst of those moments, even in the midst of those moments that I won't tell people because I'm ashamed of what they will think about me. In the midst of those moments where I'm disgusted to think back about the way that I acted or the thing that I said or the thing that I did. In those moments where I think if the people who love me just knew what I had done, there's no chance they would associate with me. I have to hold those two things in tension and say, even in those moments, I was seen and known and loved. That debt had been settled and paid even then. We don't have time to tackle the whole concept of forgiveness, but at the very least I have to make this warning, is that if you are willing to settle into that position, to hold these two things in tension, to hold in the one hand how deep your brokenness runs and hold in the other that you trust the king's forgiveness and his goodness, it will flip your scales of judgment and justice and mercy on their head. Because this servant didn't get it, and so he wouldn't act in a way that was merciful. He wouldn't suspend his right for what he thought was just. He still had to keep count. He still had to keep score. But when we let this settle into our hearts, we become the kind of people who can let founts of forgiveness flow out of us into the world around us that is covered and racked with guilt. And what kind of Christian witness would that be? if the church resumed its place of being people who forgave not 7 times, but 70 times, 7 times. If we were the people who understood that we could hold those two things in tension and live into the kind of reality that Jesus called us. Let me say a quick prayer, and then we'll be done. Father, we come before you, and God, just so grateful for the ability to gather here tonight, grateful for who you are. God, it seems almost unfair that we would be able to enter into your presence. God, as I look over the brokenness of my life and the shame and the sin, it seems unfair that someone like me should be able to enter into the presence of someone so holy and pure. And yet, Father, you have settled the debt that was due so that I could be in your presence, so that we could be in your presence here and forevermore. God, we thank you that you are a God who loves and who would pay the price to invite us into eternity with you. We thank you that you are a God who steps down out of your place and into ours, so that we might know you, that we might have the scales of justice and mercy flip for ourselves, and in turn flip the scales of mercy and justice for other people. Father, we thank you for who you are and all the many good gifts that you give. I pray all these things in your Son's name. Amen. You guys are dismissed.